Okay, I think we can start. It's my pleasure to give a very warm welcome to those of you who are present, and also to those of you who, for one reason or another, could not come to Hanover. We, that is the conveners of this event, Sinah, Kloß, Claudio, Pinheiro, and me, are glad that this conference finally takes place, although the circumstances are somewhat different than what we had planned initially. Let me give you a brief history of this conference. The idea for this conference came up during a stay of Claudio Pinheiro at the Global South Study Center of the University of Cologne in summer 2018. At that time, Sinah Kloß also was working in the center. In the meantime, she took up a job at the neighboring University of Bonn, but still associated to the Global South Studies Center. So we had the plan for this conference, and in September 2018, we handed in the proposal. We got a positive to the Volkswagen Foundation in 2019. Early the year, we got a positive response, and we started planning for the conference. In fall 2019, then for technical reasons, we had to postpone it to the summer 2020. Well, and then you all know what happened. So then came COVID, and we had to postpone this event several times. Due to the pandemic, also we had many deliberations with among each other, but also with the Volkswagen Foundation, talking about we postponed it once more, then the pandemic didn't allow it. Then we talked about having it a completely online conference, but of course that's not the same as having it here. And also an online conference with people from all over the world and almost all time zones you can imagine is not very easy. Also at a certain point when in Europe the situation of the pandemic was getting better, but it was going up in Latin America and Asia, we discussed whether we would have a hybrid conference, but at that moment it would have meant that only people from Europe could have attended and people from Latin America or India wouldn't have been able to attend. So exactly the topic of our symposium, global inequalities in academia, would have reflected itself very, very badly in this conference. So also we decided not to do it. Well, finally, in the beginning of this year, we took the risk to say we'll have an event in person in October. And I have to remind you that in the spring of this year, it was not clear how things would go. Well, happily enough now, we were right, and so we can have this event here. Of course, we are only about half of the people we had who are participating, but still I'm glad that at least we can meet, and also we've all learned by now to handle these kind of digital communications. But we are very pleased that most of the speakers we invited initially for a conference 2 years ago were still willing and able to participate, which after 3 years of insecurity and for a while little communication from our side, because we didn't know what was going to happen, is really something surprising. So thank you all of you for your patience and also for the faith in this project and for staying with us for this long time. So 3 years after handing in this project, we are finally in this beautiful place, the Herrenhausen Palace. And for those of you who are not with us, well, I can only confirm this is a great place, also with a nice surrounding. So I will give you a few information on this place in a moment. But most importantly, as you can see, this is a big place with also big auditoriums. And so we can stay here. We have this big auditorium, not so much because we are so many people, but because of the technical part of this hybrid conference. But also it's easier for us to obey to these rules and restrictions necessary due to the pandemic. So But let me just briefly explain the rules in this building, but generally in Germany at the moment. So if you're sitting on a place, and of course if you're eating, drinking and so on, you can take off the masks. Only if, so also in the auditorium, only if you move around in the room or in the building, you should put it on. Yeah, so of course you can leave it on if you wish to, but I think most of us are glad to take off the mask. Okay, yeah, I think that's the most important technical information as to rules of moving around. Coming back to the palace, I would like to give you a short introduction to the place, and which is also directly linked to the Volkswagen Foundation, the sponsor of this event, and whom we also would like to thank very much for the support and also for accompanying us over all these years. So, a short history of the place. In the 19th century, Herrenhausen Palace was a summer residence of the royal house of Hanover. But its history, however, begins much earlier, at the beginning of the 17th century. A first sort of summer residence was built here in 1636 in the agricultural surroundings of Hanover, in order to supply the court, but also as a summer residence. And then in 1680, Duke Ernst August, which is a famous name, and the actual Duke also is called Ernst August of Hanover, felt the need to have a more representative real palace in his eyes. And then he himself drew up the plans for this building, a centerpiece flanked by 4 symmetrically arranged buildings. But after 15 years, Ernst August died and construction stopped. What went on, but however, was the princess who occupied herself of the gardens. And so the beautiful Herrenhausen Gardens, which you hopefully have time to visit or already had, they were built and also planned by Princess Sophie at that time. Ever since then, there have been modifications, but the main features have been preserved. During the 18th century, let me say it briefly, the House of Hanover was united with the Crown of Great Britain. So the British kings, which were also princes of Hanover, came here for summer residence, also to this place. Well, after, the building more or less had this function until the 19th century, and then it was destroyed almost completely during the Second World War. Only a large flight of steps had been preserved. And that was for about 50, 60 years the situation in this place. And then in 2010, 9-10, the renaissance of this place started, and only 4 years later, this new palace was put into operation as a conference and event center, including the modern technology which now allows us to have this conference here. So the Volkswagen Foundation, who is based in Hanover, was a very important partner in the reconstruction of this palace as a new modern functioning building. And this is why I felt the need to explain you briefly about this place, because it's a modern place with all the technology, but still it has something of the old palace. So once again, thank you very much to the Volkswagen Foundation for including us in this program that they call Herrenhausen Conferences, who are held in these buildings. Now, before I give over to Claudio, let me give you some more administrative information on the conference. First of all, unfortunately, one of the conveners, Sinah Kloß, is unable to assist, but she left us a brief video message, which you probably can hear now. Technicians, can you please pass the Sinah's video?
Hello and good day, and welcome to Hanover. I'm thrilled and happy that we could finally realize our conference and I've been looking forward to your talks, our conversations and discussions, the coffee breaks and dinners, of course, with you. But as you can see here in the background of my screen, I'm unfortunately not in Hanover, as some of you might have also already noticed. I cannot join you neither face-to-face nor online. I apologize for that, and I would have loved to meet you all in person. But as you all know, life sometimes has other plans than we have anticipated. Very recently, my son Severin was born, and as he seemed to have been in quite a hurry, to join us in this world, his arrival was more than 2 months early. Both of us are fine, but for this reason, I have to be with him at the hospital now every day and take care of him. This is why I cannot join you, and I'm very sorry for that, but I'm sure you will understand. I still sincerely hope that we will have the chance to meet in future at another event. For now and today, I would like to thank my co-conveners, Barbara and Claudio, who did not complain once, not once, since they learned in early September that they will have to take on all my tasks and jobs. And I would also like to thank Martina Gockel and all the students, assistants of the Global South Study Center for their wonderful support of me in this situation, our team and our conference. Last but not least, I would also like to extend my thanks to all of you for accepting our invitation, your patience, and sharing your work in the following days. I will sure to be catching up with your presentations and papers in the future. And I really hope that we can engage in some conversation in some way in the future. So let's stay in touch, and I hope you have some very inspiring conversations over the next days. Best wishes from Bonn to all of you.
We'll follow a few of the conferences. So one last administrative information. I would like to introduce to you to our administrative personnel from the GSSC, Martina Gockel-Frank, Aline Schmiedel, and Lucia Heinzelmann. Most of you have already exchanged incountable, innumerous emails with both of them. So up here there's Martina, and Aline. Lucia will join us tonight. Yeah, a big thank you to both of you, but also to Ms. Harvard-Faye from the Volkswagen Foundation, who probably is listening to us, probably not. But I also would like to thank her, because she also was very helpful and will still be helpful, because also we'll have later on, we'll have dinner, and tomorrow we'll have lunch and dinner upstairs, also in one of these beautiful rooms, looking over the Herrenhausen Gardens. And this is all prepared and organized by Ms. Harvard-Faye, so also thank you very much. So Martina and Aline, as you know, any problems you have with whatever refunding of travel expenses and so on, just get in touch with both of them and they will help you. Well, so much, I think, for the moment on the technical side. You all have the program. And I would like to hand over now to Claudio, who will give a thematic introduction to our conference.
Thank you so much, Barbara. And also I would like to start with thanking the GSSC, where this idea was nourished and cooked from the very beginning. It was an incredible atmosphere for developing this idea. And also, of course, to VB, to Volkswagen Stiftung, for the support and, as you said, the trusting that we would make it despite all the difficulties that we've been facing through with the pandemics and all. It is really special to count on this both. And of course, we could not, I would like to extend it to my dear colleagues and friends, Barbara and Sinah, for the enormous work that we shared, and to the staff and the friends from the GSSC, especially Martin and Eileen, for the incredible work, teamwork we've been having throughout this time. So I would just share some thoughts with you, probably concerning the idea of self. I'll just get this removed so that I can. Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, I promise I just have 4 slides, so I will not bother you much. Thoughts of where the self is. So for definitions of where the self is, it's really a complicated issue throughout, and I think most of us have been reading a lot on this. And I will start with a history of one book, a very tiny book published in 1554 in Lisbon. So this book is called Cartilha em Tamil e Português. So it is a booklet in Tamil and Portuguese languages, actually a booklet and catechism and grammar of the Tamil language tamed within the linguistic structures of Latin and Portuguese languages. This splendid work is presenting basic rules of the Tamil language to speakers of Latin or Neo-Latin languages. So I would just like to show you the frontispiece of this book. It's a very tiny and interesting book. What is the purpose of this book? It was one of the first of many instruments dedicated to building communication skills between missionaries and colonizers about South Indian societies, which later would make possible the colonial project associated with the expansion of Christianity, which was marked by the conjunction between language, religion, colonialism, and power. From a scientific viewpoint, this was a work of incredible technical and epistemic sophistication, being one of the first ever books printed by colonizers to use Tamil mobile letter types, which facilitated several reprints and circulations. Moreover, it introduced Tamil language through the rules of Latin and Portuguese representations of grammar and epistemology, becoming a tool to build equivalences in terms of the time analogies between non-homologous words in both linguistic and epistemic senses. Ultimately, this effort helped building the grounds for the colonial conquest and domination. And what does this book mark? The beginning of European colonialism, initially Iberian, and the Western idea of modernity, and our Western idea of modernity imposed to territories and populations in places in Africa, Asia, and the Americas. Basically, it marks the toxic relationship between knowledge, production, colonialism mediated by power, based through a series of operations related to a continuum that expands from 16th century to the present. Language has been and still is a fundamental in this endeavor, including epistemic conquest of semantic territories, which would have consequences in the way we know the world until today. What does this book inaugurate? So the emergence of forms of power associated to scientific colonial curiosity about non-European societies and people. It also inaugurates the perception of power in terms of spatial and moral economies, representing things characterized in terms of geographies of inequality. And this is one concept that is probably interesting for addressing the idea of self. The idea of power, hegemony, and wealth, and the absence of these attributes could be read through special dimensions considering economic, geographical, and moral philosophy very clearly since at least Adam Smith in 18th century. This perspective is not far from what Alfred Sauvy would describe 200 years later than Adam Smith in his very tiny article called Trois mondes, une planète, 3 worlds, 1 planet, from 52, emphasizing the difference between the first and the second and the third world, most especially the third world. Although the concept is not much used anymore, third world. It is easy to remember that it evokes a division of the world in terms of geography of economic inequalities. characteristic of the time after the Second World War, which epitomized the erosion of colonialist models of exploitation, opening room to disputes over a renovated vocabulary, able to reframe wealth in terms of speciality. Poor and rich countries, developed and undeveloped regions, peripheral and semi-peripheral areas. In the memories of most of us here, the concept of South is perhaps related to these ideas. Although a very ancient term, it was consolidated to the Western political imagination in the early 1970s, addressed by Southern countries to voice demands of a stronger political participation in global geopolitics. Still since the 1970s, the UNDP constituted a South Commission. In fact, it hosted in Germany and chaired by Willy Brandt to address problems derived from the structural inequality affecting developed and non-developed regions. South then was introduced as a synonym to the Third World, and a bring-up term for encompassing spaces of economic inequality. And this was I'm not getting it moving to the next. And then next, yes. So this was the face of the publication of the Brandt report in 1998. That's the outcome of this debate, and that was the brand line. If for those who remember, dividing the world between the South and the North, avoiding South Africa and Australia at that moment. It also, of course, brought a lot of graphic representations of inequality with that. So this long history of economic and philosophical debate that entangles graphical, spatial, and artistic representations of inequalities in terms of maps, league tables, graphics, paintings, pictures, artifacts of museums, etc., is part of this story. In recent decades, South has re-emerged as an inspired concept in the words of some, a metaphor, a shared intellectual project in discussions of inequality in science and knowledge production. This approach played a key role for readdressing academic and scientific dependency associated with the structure of intellectual division of labor impacting the global economy of knowledge production. Humanities have benefited significantly from this debate, still oriented toward a spatial dimension, reinforcing economic aspects of a semantic of difference, where South has somehow disentangled from wealth, but still referred as a logic of dependency and inequality, not only in political and economic terms, but scientifically. Therefore, South has been used to represent topographies associated to territories of dispossession, places historically deprived from epistemic apparatus for thinking autonomously. Circumstances and spaces in which the lack of the control of epistemic tools used for scientific thinking affected both economically and affluent and economic deprived societies. Under these circumstances, the South represents geography of epistemic inequalities, or spaces for critical thinking within a structural continuum of academic domination and dependency. South has many origins as a term, if you like, as well. And one that is predating this debate is the well-known experience of feminist debate in Argentina around the project of the Revista Sur, so the South magazine, that brought diversity within the discussion. What was not referred to economics at first, but to another ontological, if you like, dimension of the South. So, these geographies of inequality also encompass the whole new ontology of otherness, based on economic rationality, dimensions for associated to social inequality and human-environment relations, which recent discussions around the ontological turn, especially in Latin America and South American anthropology, had played an interesting role. Along those lines, some people are addressing South as referred to geographies of ontological inequality. I would like to go back to that tiny book from 1554. So the spatial representations of inequality were already very much present at that book. It was produced by 3 authors named 3 Malabari Jesuits under the supervision of the Franciscan Frei João de Vila do Conde. Although the name of the supervisor appears very clear in the work, from the original handwritten edition, the real name of the authors were made anonymous, having their identity obliterated and deprived several times throughout the history. It would take a long time until the names of Vicente de Nazaré, Jorge Carvalho, and Tomé da Cruz dos Índios would be revealed as the real authors of that magnificent work. Interestingly, the obliteration of their names in favor of the Jesuit order were not attributed to scientific dishonesty, but to a concept of authorship and personhood that operated that time. The concept was called autoritas, in which, in association with the principle of analogy, would allow Western colonizers to translate their words, concepts, and ontological realms that represented forms of diversity. Finally, and very clearly, these 3 intellectuals were effectively not named Vicente de Nazaré, Jorge Carvalho, or even Tomé da Cruz dos Índios, once they were originally from Malabar. And these Malabari intellectuals have had their identities obliterated and their sophisticated scholarship misappropriated in different ways time and again. In fact, this book could have been considered an inaugural landmark, an example of this long history of inequality in science affected by intersectional dimensions and refer to representations of diversity in terms of geographies of inequality. More importantly, this text is dedicated to teaching and educating on the basis of structural inequality. It educates about the social roles of scientific inequality, which associates linguistic rules and Christian values, through a structure of dependency that assigns roles in a structure of international division of intellectual labor, which science and its heuristic ground of support destitute the political and religious dimensions, reinforcing the belief that this is possible, that the belief in the possibility of an argument that exempts heuristic from simultaneously economic, epistemic, secular, and ontological dimensions, or the belief that it's possible to have a pure science detached from the political dimension of it. What else this book inaugurates? It probably inaugurates a Western scientific attitude towards diversity. This tiny book inaugurates a gigantic scientific fact that would unfold in a series of events influencing the history of colonialism and the simultaneously economic, scientific, and epistemic dimensions together with the cognition. So it's really helped changing how we know things and how we know things about societies other than mainstream societies. By one side, it would influence the life of its authors and other intellectuals involved in the preparation and printing of the text. In fact, it would inaugurate a procedure, expectations, and attitudes that would profoundly influence my professional career and some of many others, certainly everyone in this room, and even those who were assistants from other places right now. Bringing out a concept that someone else has called coloniality of knowledge. Although the idea of individual authorship was not clearly defined, countless intellectuals from colonial societies worked enormously to help their societies to be understood, in other terms translated, which later generated conditions for exercising colonial power, and had their ideas usurpated in the name of the colonial authorship project. And this is not yet an already solved program, or as we could put it otherwise, and we haven't still found what we were looking for. 10 days ago, a BBC special program explored the consequence of the academic structure based on excellence linked to publication. It's shown how Kenya has become one of the world's largest producers of academic articles developed by anonymous authors. In other words, ghostwriters. It is an enormous structure that fuels the need of central societies and central scholars for a steady stream of articles that keep their CVs competitive. Many of these anonymous authors do not have academic titles, but produce doctoral theses or texts that end up published in major journals, building the careers of excellence of scholars and in central institutions. In the case of the 16th century Jesuit Malabars or the ghostwriters of 20th century Kenya, is no different from the aspects that illustrate the career of countless intellectuals coming from the global south, or even from the north in precarious jobs position. Excellence and productivity need precariousness and inequality to maintain themselves, to sustain the lust of the prizes, scholarships, and preeminent positions. What's being done to change this? For God's sake, the colonization turn, the colonial turn in science, a consistent movement that has affected distinct scientific contexts, particularly global south and the African diaspora in Americas, that face the task of reviewing how science is produced and reproduced, most particularly how it is taught. Part of the understanding of and effort has included the rescue and revision of histories of the science, demonstrating how the great science depended and continues to depend on the intense labor of intellectuals erased from the historical records of the field. Retrieving in science, reinforcing large institutional structures and micro cleavages of dependence on universities, laboratories, and research institutions. One solution has been to reinscribe obliterated diversity in the canon of science, helping review erased names, ideas, but fundamentally non-hegemonic scientific projects. So it's not only the question of reviewing the vocabulary of the science, but the political projects of science at all. Unfortunately, the power structure got used to the rhetoric of the colonization and ended up finding ways to adjust to new ideas to old ideals, engaging with the inclusion of diversity without promoting real transformation of structures that historically produce and maintain scientific inequalities. Diversity has been used as a representation of difference to be included in the scientific canon. And it has been happening even when we identify the real authorships of concepts and theories developed by Southern authors or by subaltern authors working in the North academia. We engage with ideas associated from broader scientific projects. In other words, we identify concepts, but we fail to engage with their scientific policy projects capable of promoting real social justice based on science. Incorporating social theories, stripped the political projects ended up converting diversity into a scientific and social commodity rather than into a public good capable of promoting social justice. I'm finishing. Evidence exists for this example in heavily committed foundations of scientific promotion of philanthropy to incorporate diversity as a way of reducing inequality without critical sense of how ideas and people who represent diversity operate in power structures and projects or research groups. The idea of decolonization, in whose origins the political project of social transformation from academia can be identified, ended up reinforcing what we intend to combat. Usually, funding to promote diversity in science has been translated to the presence of subaltern names, concepts, and bodies, and racialized social and scientific groups encapsulated by a resilient structure of power. On the other hand, reducing the relevance and the contribution of peripheral or subordinated authors to conceptual expressions of scientific theories. Once again, what it intends to combat and reduce its transformative potential. Even when we rescue authors from anonymity produced by power structure, racist or sexist, just to mention two dimensions, we tend to represent their contributions in terms of individual authorship, which is the preferred way in which the scientific canon incorporates diversity into hegemonic structure. We reiterate the commitment with the individualistic authorial structure of excellence that even promoting diversity even while promoting diversity erases it. This is the protest of some African philosopher and of the feminist thought in relation to the individualization of authorship, both in theories and concepts, as well as political projects dedicated to transformation. Still being a southern intellectual or representing a subordinated group in a northern society does not provide the ontological stance that builds the innate of political critical sense. Identity does not grant conscience, and conscience does not make one an activist or a politically aware scientist. And if science is not politically aware, it produces commodification and subalternization of scientific beings instead of transformation. In addition to representation of diversity, scientific field needs new attitudes toward the production of science. This is my last slide and last paragraph as well. I would just like to share with you that the representations of inequality by thinkers was not only hegemonic all the time, and that people also thought of meaningful ways of representing how diversity was excluded from the mainstream society. This is Florence Nightingale diagram on the causes of mortality in the army in the West from 1858. And of course, the most well-known diagrams developed by William Du Bois for addressing the color line in Americas. But, and then I try to paraphrase Henri Magritte, the painter, with that. The illustration we have addressing this conference is really not only a pie in the sense of, the diagrams that illustrate inequality in science. This is not only a pie. It is really addresses a real life of people that have been historically undermined by the structures of power. What do we propose? A southern attitude, revealed ethical engagement with science is based on practices and attitudes that take into consideration the intersectional dimensions of inequality operating in science at large. Our challenge here is probably to work towards a proposal that help this type of attitude in science to promote transformation and possible future for generation of scientists, not only science are not again marked by this spell. This scientific world needs engaging with possible future, not karmic destinies that benefit science at large. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Claudio.